Hello and welcome to the best US politics podcast anyone could wish for. It's American Friction, and I'm Jacob Jarvis.
And I'm Chris Jones.
You are.
I am.
So in this
Always
episode, and always will be. In this episode, we are taking a step away from the mainstream to talk about something that realistically doesn't get very much coverage, especially from an international perspective, and that is the political feelings and impact of Native Americans. So Chris, this is something you've wanted to cover for a while now. Why is that?
Well, for the exact reason you kind of outlined there, hardly ever gets spoken about the issues and the political impacts of the federal government on Native Americans, Alaskans, and Hawaiians. Their voices basically are hardly ever amplified. We never really hear about the issues that Native Americans, Hawaiians, and Alaskans face, yet there are millions of them, and they've faced the same issues for centuries, basically since the Constitution was signed in the 1789, I think it was.
Yes, according to your research.
According to my research, which is very good.
I'm sure.
But despite making up about 3.4% of the population, Native American people make up just 0.07% of federal elected officials, which is a tiny number.
Yeah, that feels startlingly lower than it should be.
Exactly. And I wanted to find out what's behind all of that and what are the real key issues that Native Americans face. And also, is there a growing number of people that want to get involved in federal government from Native American tribes, for example? So I sat down and spoke to Carrie Lowry Schuettpelz, who spent 7 years working as a policy advisor in the Obama administration, focusing on homelessness and Native policy. She's also an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina and the author of the book, The Indian Card, Who Gets to be Native in America. So she's very well placed to answer all of that.
Well, I look forward to hearing some of those answers. Let's not wait any longer and let's take a listen to that conversation.
Carrie, welcome to American Friction. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a pretty broad question, but it's a question that I think will help to set the scene for our listeners. And it comes from one of our listeners, actually, as well, because from Gabby, who says, I'd like to know how governing works within the nations and how that interplays with the US government structures. I just wondered if you could give us kind of an overarching view of that.
Sure. A lot of Native American nations have governance structures quite similar to the governance structure of the U.S. federal government in the sense that they have a president or however it's stylized, a leadership position, a chief, principal chief, something like that. Many have cabinet level agencies, just like we do in the U.S. government. So things like Bureau of Land, education, housing, those sorts of functionalities. Many Native nations have their own court system.
Yeah.
So they have a Department of Justice. And for federally recognized tribes, certainly in the lower 48 U.S., which is what I primarily think about, they run elections for these positions. So they're elected positions. Many times you'll have a tribal council that's elected by district. So people in a certain district represent a representative from that district. So in a lot of ways, it looks like, I think, governance systems that folks are fairly familiar with. In terms of the relationship between Native nations governments and the United States government, there are a lot of government to government processes that happen. So in most federal programs that involve Native nations, there's a pretty lengthy tribal consultation period where the U.S. government consults with the leadership of federally recognized tribes to get their input on sort of what the programs look like. The sort of primary relationship, and it's not as if Native nations don't have any relationship with the state or states inside of which they are. But the primary relationship, I would say, between tribal governments and any sort of U.S. government would be a federal relationship. And that was established hundreds of years ago by the Supreme Court. Of course, they still maintain relationships with the states, but it really is sort of a federalized system.
And you mentioned elections there. I just want to talk about this past federal election that saw Donald Trump elected to the White House. The advanced Native political leadership said that there was a 300% rise in the number of indigenous people running for elected office. What do you think? What do you think is behind that rise? And is that really encouraging to see?
It's encouraging. I think that anytime you have very small numbers, an increase is going to make the percentage look larger, right?
Right.
So we still do not have a significant amount of, unfortunately, Native representation in the houses of Congress here in the US. I wish it was much higher. There are a handful of people in the House or Senate who identify as Native, and it should be much larger, right? It's good to see that numbers are increasing, but again, when you're talking about a small number to begin with, a 300% increase is not going to correlate with a gigantic numerical increase.
Why do you think the Native Americans, Alaskans, and Hawaiians perhaps don't want to get involved with federal elections? Do you think that it's perhaps, maybe there's a sense that it's a system that isn't really set up for them, and perhaps a system that they don't feel particularly involved with in the first place?
It's possible.
Yeah.
There is no one look for a Native American tribe. There is no one look for a Native American person, in the sense of, we live all over the place. We have all different experiences. We have all different, education levels, and some feel compelled to run for federal elections and some don't. But I will say that I think particularly for those Native people who live in this country, who are affiliated with one of these sort of federally recognized tribes, their own government, their tribal government, is really important and meaningful in their life in a way that they do have representation there.
Yeah.
I would love to see more representation at national and federal levels, but I think that will only come with time as more people sort of feel compelled to do that. It's also the case that, unfortunately, in many Native communities on reservations, these are not usually population centers. And so to get a vote, to get, enough people to support you in a way that would lead to your election, is going to require you to go to other places, sort of not exclusively concentrate inside of your reservation or your district.
Do you think that also the fact that there are still a lot of fighting for, I guess, civil liberties as well is a major issue that plays into I guess, integration with the federal system as well? For example, when I was in DC for a little while, I helped to produce a story in Navajo Nation, which basically spans across multiple different states, but in, I think, around Arizona, 30% of families there, of Native American families, don't actually have access to clean running water, and have had so many roadblocks put between them from, I guess, the federal system to actually get that water. It kind of feels like there's a resentment there. Do you think that's a fair embodiment of how some Native Americans feel, that they feel, I guess, almost resentful towards the federal government because of still in this day and age having to fight for a lot of civil liberties that many other Americans get access to pretty easily?
Sure. I mean, a simple glance at federal policies over the years, federal Indian policy and law, demonstrates that Native communities have been marginalized in all sorts of ways at a structural level, right? I mean, the simple fact that many reservations are far removed from the ancestral lands of that tribe is a pretty good indicator that those lands are going to be maybe more remote, less desirable in some meaningful way. And so, what we see is large amounts of poverty on reservations. And again, that has a lot to do with these sort of structural things that have happened from the U.S. federal government. And so, in terms of just the simple reality of what's happening on the ground. I think that that's also compounded by the fact that the amount of funding being infused into these communities by the federal government has not meaningfully increased in a long time. And so year over year, when you're seeing sort of the same amount of money, not increased for inflation, not increased for need, it becomes more challenging to address those basic needs, right? It may surprise people who have never been to a reservation or seen the magnitude of the sheer geography of what we're talking about. I mean, Navajo Nation, which you just talked about, and I have spent some time working with, Navajo Nation is larger than many US states.
Yeah.
And yet the population of people that live on Navajo Nation is probably under 200,000 people. And so you're talking about very remote places, which are difficult to deliver resources to anyway, or deliver that sort of infrastructure to. And without a federal infusion of capital, that becomes especially difficult, right? So I'm not sure I would say resentment, but maybe distrust is a better word. I mean, I think that for good reason, probably Native people and communities have a fair and healthy amount of distrust of the same federal government that for years tried to exterminate them altogether.
Yeah.
Moved them to locations that they did not want to be, stole their children to Indian boarding schools, terminated their tribes altogether. I mean, the list goes on and on.
And just on that displacement, how damaging has that in itself been to tribes all over America? I know that there was the Indian Relocation Act in 1956, for example, that basically took Native Americans from their homeland and put them somewhere completely different. How damaging to identity amongst generations of Native Americans has that really been?
I mean, there's a few things, right? So growing up in the US, I would venture to say most children in elementary school learn about the federal policy known as removal. And we learn about it through things like the Trail of Tears, which was these forced and violent removal of entire tribes from their homelands to a different place. And they would make these treks on foot without the appropriate clothing, without shoes often, in the dead of winter. And many did not survive. And so, of course, that becomes detrimental to these communities just in terms of sheer numbers. There are accounts of tribes that lost a third of all of their people on these marches and then through disease after. So that certainly was something that happened primarily in the 19th century. The act that you're talking about, the Indian Relocation Act, much more recent, right, in the 50s and into the 60s. So that was actually built by the federal government as an incentive program to get particularly young, skilled Native people off of their reservation and into urban centers. And one of the biggest reasons why this was done was to further this goal of assimilation, right? The more that we can take the Indian out of the man, right? There's that famous quote, right? And so what ended up happening was the federal government would promise Native people all sorts of things. We'll find you a job. We'll find you housing. We'll offer you money. You'll have a great new city to live in, on and on and on. Often those promises were not kept. And so you had tens of thousands of Native people relocating to cities without any safety net at all. And often they would return home because of loneliness. They didn't have a community, right? But what's been really interesting, and at least partly a result of the Indian Relocation Act, is that the patterns of where Native people are living have changed significantly. It used to be the case that very few Native people lived in urban centers or cities, right? And today, something like 80% of all Native people live in those places. And so that really has been a meaningful shift just in terms of how many people are and are not still in their tribal community geographically.
There's a quote that you write in the book, and I just want to read that out because I think it struck me. And you write this. You said, "While I was growing up in Middle America, 1,000 miles away from the Lumbee tribe, sort of feeling Indian, sort of not, raised in a family with, how do I say this, alcoholic tendencies, often left alone, always feeling less beautiful than other girls in my class. My hair, a fuzzy ponytail, theirs smooth and curled inward at the ends and sprayed into place." You mentioned it a second ago, but it seems to me that if that was your feeling, how deep does this feeling of, I guess, isolation amongst communities outside of reservations, how deep does that really run? And is that perhaps a key reason as to why, I come back to it, why Native Americans don't want to be part of the federal system so much?
One of the most interesting and also comforting things about writing this book was meeting people who shared an experience I had, which was growing up not feeling like I was Native enough, right? And part of that was this dislocation, right? Like, I grew up 1,000 miles from my tribe. I was surrounded not by Lumbee family, but by mostly white people, with the exception of my immediate family, right? And so I think that was a really difficult aspect in my own childhood, was sort of rationally knowing who I was, but not being able to find that that identity around me. And then whenever I would go back to the my Lumbee family and North Carolina, where my tribe is located, feeling like I didn't fit in there either. And so, I think that is a really big part of a lot of stories. And the amount of people I met and talked to in the process of writing this book who sort of shared a similar sense. I'm sorry that that's happening, but it did feel somewhat comforting to say, okay, this is actually quite common. And it's not just, believe it or not, for people who didn't grow up on reservation or, in community. Even for people who did, I think there is this sense of, well, am I enough? And part of that has to do with federal policies that have been implemented over the years in terms of measuring Native people by blood, saying that, if you don't have a certain amount of blood, you're not actually Indian, you're white, trying to assimilate us into the broader society, making our customs and our languages feel foreign at boarding school and other places. I mean, it's probably not then surprising that you have a lot of Native people walking around in the US who feel like, maybe I'm just not enough. Maybe I'm not Native enough.
On the flip side of that, you say that there's been a massive skyrocketing in the number of people who claim Native heritage. I wonder if you could talk us through that a little bit and what's behind that rise.
Sure. So the U.S. conducts a census every 10 years. And between the 2000 census and the 2020 census, the number of people self-identifying as American Indian or Alaskan Native more than doubled. It went from 4 million to 9.7 million. And births can't explain that, and adoptions can't explain that. A parachuting of new humans onto this earth can't explain that. The only thing that can explain it really is more people feeling compelled to check that box. Now, why are the more people feeling compelled to check that box? I mean, certainly there have been scholars who have theorized things. So one of the biggest is family lore. There are people who have just been told, by parents or grandparents or relatives, well, you have Native ancestry. Someone in your family tree was Native. And so people live with that as reality, even if they can't tell you who that person is or how they're connected, even if they don't have a meaningful connection to that tribe today or anyone who's part of that tribe. So I think that, to be honest, the more that I sort of looked into these issues, the more research I did and talking to folks, to me, that feels like one of the bigger drivers of what's happening here is that more people are feeling, whether because they've been told or they've done a little bit of ancestry.com research or something, they are taking on that identity as truth.
On a human level, I mean, you've just explained there how you felt growing up, how that you had questions of being Indian enough, which is an incredible thought to have. When you consider that people are basically claiming heritage on, let's say, a hunch, is that a bit of a punch in the gut, I guess? Because Native American people have gone through so much and still are, and face so many different barriers with the federal system, and people simply just check the box because they've been told that they have Native American heritage.
There are layers of complexity to that, right?
Sure.
So it's sort of like peeling an onion. It's just layer after layer, and I don't begrudge anyone for wanting to understand where they come from.
Of course.
I think that that's a really natural human instinct. I think it's great that people want to go and make these elaborate family trees and figure out, who are your people. I think that that's really great. At the same time, I think there's a big difference between doing that and not having any modern day connection to a tribe and enrolling in a tribe, right? There's a big difference. If you want to enroll in a tribe, well, first of all, you're going to have to abide by the tribe's process, whatever that is. You're going to have to submit paperwork. You're going to have to, demonstrate your lineage in some meaningful way. But you also should probably be connected to that tribe in some meaningful way. And it's not that you have to live on the reservation or live on that tribe's land. It's just that you need a meaningful connection to that community. And so I consider those things to be very different. The idea that there are people who claim Native heritage who may or may not have it, that's just a fact that's going to happen. When it becomes problematic is when people profit from that identity.
Sure.
So when you have people saying, oh, I'm from such and such a tribe, and now I will claim that identity in public spaces that earn me money, whether as a professor or an actor or a writer or whatever. I think that that's where we have to have a real conversation about what does this identity mean?
Just a couple more questions, Carrie, and I'm going to bring it back to the present day. And it wouldn't be an American Friction episode without mentioning Donald Trump. Already with this administration, there's been some there's been a lot of controversy, but there's been some controversy around birthright citizenship and also the freeze to federal grants and loans, which many tribes rely on in certain ways. But when it comes to the attitudes towards Native Americans, Alaskans, and Hawaiians, how do you think this administration is going to act? Do you think there's going to be much difference? Do you think it's going to be worse? We've already seen with immigrants, for example, how they are treating those kinds of people. What do you think that the attitude is going to be towards Native Americans?
I mean, all I can really speak to is what I've observed so far. And, a few weeks ago, President Trump signed a memo that actually related directly to my tribe, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. Urging or requiring the Department of Interior, which is one of our cabinet level agencies, requiring them to work together with the Lumbee tribe to figure out how they could get federal recognition. It's a big deal. We've been seeking federal recognition for over 150 years. At the same time, the memo didn't do much. It required that department to work to figure out maybe what are some ways that we could solve this problem. It seems like one of the reasons why that memo became a priority was because of polling numbers, right? So where are people voting? Who are they voting for? And in the case of the Lumbee, it turned out that in 2024, more people in Robeson County, North Carolina, where the Lumbee tribe is headquartered, voted for Donald Trump. And so it seems like that particular, and I won't call it a policy because it wasn't a policy, it was a memo. It seems like that particular action was driven by who were the campaign supporters. That is the observation I have made just based on that one document. I think what I will say is that Native people, Native nations, were used to living lives of contradiction as it relates to federal policy. Every phase of federal Indian policy over the last 250 years has been a direct contradiction to the policy before. It's a ping pong match. You're going from one extreme to the other, back to the other extreme. And so we're no strangers to this idea of, yes, maybe there will be some policies passed that that are good for our communities, and there will be, on the other side, policies passed that are terrible for our communities. So I think that it's going to be important just to sort of have a real discourse about which are which.
And then just finally, Carrie, a lot of our listeners perhaps won't really know too much of the situation or the difficulties that Native Americans face, but hopefully they're a little bit better off now listening to this episode. But if you were to speak to our listeners who perhaps want to know more but don't necessarily know a lot as it is, what's the one thing you would want them to know about Native Americans and politics and how it relates to the federal system? What's the key thing that people should really know?
I talked about this in the book, but I think one of the most valuable things to know about Native American tribes and nations is that they're all different.
Yeah.
And so treating Native America as a monolith, this is what I say in the book. It's a bit like saying you have an interest in Asian culture, right? There is no one.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to separate out, which tribe you're talking about, which people you're talking about. There are 574 tribes that are federally recognized across the U.S., continental U.S., and then into Alaska. And they're all different. They all have different histories, different cultures and traditions and interests. And so as it relates to their relationship with the federal government, I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Carrie, it's a brilliant book, and I'm really glad that you've been able to join us to talk a bit more about it. Thanks for joining me on American Friction.
Yeah, thanks so much.
So that was Carrie Schuettpelz with you there, Chris. Just before we sign off, what did you take away from that conversation?
Well, for me, it was that last point that she really made, that there are hundreds of Native American tribes, and they're all different. They shouldn't be painted with one brush. The federal government impacts them all differently, and they all have different relationships with the federal government itself. So I also think that perhaps one reason that the issues that they face don't get talked about enough is perhaps a lot of people don't actually realize that they're around anymore, and that's just absolutely not true. There's a huge number of Native Americans still around today, and they don't just exist within reservations themselves. They walk among mainstream society as well, perhaps not down to their own historical choices. A lot of them have been displaced away from their tribes elsewhere, but they are there, and they very much should not be forgotten.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for having that particularly enlightening conversation with Carrie, and obviously thank you, Carrie, and thank you to all of you who listened to American Friction. We hope you enjoyed that. Remember, you can comment wherever you listen to the show, and we always welcome any feedback or points, or let us know topics you'd like us to discuss. And if you want to support American Friction to help us continue to have these sort of conversations, you can back us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/American Friction. There's a link in the show notes, and we'll be back on Friday with another panel edition of the show.